Silverwood was the kind of town where time moved slowly. Nestled between rolling hills and vast meadows, it had a charm that felt untouched by the rush of the outside world. The streets were lined with tall, leafy oak trees, their canopies casting dancing shadows on the pavement below. The heart of town was a cluster of mom-and-pop shops, an old-fashioned cafe that smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls, a small grocery store where neighbors exchanged friendly nods, and a mechanic shop where the sound of wrenches and friendly banter filled the air. Life here was simple, predictable, and safe, or at least it used to be. Lately, whispers had started to spread. Conversations that once revolved around weekend picnics and school plays had taken on a hushed, uneasy tone. Children had gone missing. Not many, but enough to send a ripple of fear through the community. Parents clutched their little ones' hands a bit tighter. Strangers were met with wary glances, and though the police reassured the town that they were doing everything they could, Silverwood was beginning to feel different. Less like home. More like a place where something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of everyday life. In the midst of this quiet tension lived the White family. Ethan White, a former soldier, had seen his fair share of danger. After serving for years overseas, he had settled into a peaceful life, trading his uniform for grease-stained overalls at the town's auto shop. He liked the rhythm of fixing things, of making the broken whole again. His wife, Sarah, worked long shifts as a nurse at the local hospital. She had a gentle way about her, the kind of warmth that made patients feel at ease even in the worst moments. But to their 9-year-old daughter, Amelia, the real heart of their family wasn't her parents. It was Holly. Holly had come into their lives unexpectedly. It was the kind of day Amelia would never forget. She remembered the way her father had walked through the front door, his hands gripping a thick leather leash, and at the other end of it was the most magnificent creature she had ever seen. A Belgian Malinois, lean and powerful, with piercing amber eyes that held a depth of understanding far beyond what a normal dog should. Holly had been a military dog, trained to protect, to serve, to follow orders. But war had no more use for her, and so Ethan had brought her home. At first, Amelia had been hesitant. Holly wasn't like the golden retrievers or fluffy poodles she had seen in town. This dog was different, disciplined, watchful, a creature of precision. But the first time Amelia reached out her hand, Holly had done something unexpected. Instead of sniffing cautiously or stepping back, the dog had leaned in, pressing her forehead softly against the little girl's palm. It was as if, in that moment, Holly had chosen her, and from then on, there was no separating them. Holly became Amelia's shadow. Every morning she walked with Amelia to school, pacing beside her with the silent confidence of a guardian. When Amelia entered the school gates, Holly would sit just outside, watching, waiting. The moment school let out, she was there, ears perked, tail wagging, as if the hours apart had been an eternity. They played in the backyard until the sun dipped behind the hills, Amelia laughing as she threw a ball, and Holly sprinted after it with unmatched speed. At night, when bad dreams crept into Amelia's sleep, Holly was always there, curled up at the foot of her bed, her steady breathing lulling the girl back into peaceful slumber. Ethan had always known Holly was special. Her training had made her different from a regular pet. But it was more than that. She had a way of sensing things, of knowing when something was wrong before anyone else did. Once, when Sarah had come home late, exhausted from a long shift, Holly had sat beside her, resting her head gently on Sarah's knee, as if offering silent comfort. Another time, when a stranger had approached Amelia a little too eagerly at the park, Holly had stepped between them, her body tense, her eyes locked onto the man until he got the message and walked away. But lately, something had changed. Holly was on edge. At first, it was subtle, just little things. She would pause mid-play, ears twitching as if listening for something Amelia couldn't hear. She started pacing more often, lingering by the front door at night, staring out the window with unwavering focus. Sometimes she would let out a low, guttural growl, though there was nothing there, at least nothing Amelia could see. "Maybe she's just adjusting," Sarah had suggested when Ethan mentioned it. "It's a big change for her, being in a family after working for so long." Ethan had nodded, but deep down, something unsettled him. Holly wasn't just restless. She was reacting to something real. One night, long after Amelia had gone to bed, Ethan found Holly sitting by the living room window. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't relaxed. She was staring, completely still, her muscles coiled tight, her breath slow and steady. He stepped closer, following her gaze. Outside, the street was quiet. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The houses were dark, their occupants long since tucked in for the night. But Holly wasn't looking at the houses. She was looking at the shadows between them. Ethan frowned. "Holly," he murmured, "what do you see?" The dog didn't move, didn't blink. A moment later, she let out a soft, warning growl. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached for the light switch, flooding the room with a warm glow. Holly finally turned away from the window, but as she settled at his feet, she remained alert, ears still flicking at the faintest of sounds. The next morning, Amelia found Holly sitting by the front door, staring outside again. The unease in her chest grew. "Holly?" she whispered, kneeling beside her. The dog turned her head, eyes meeting Amelia's. For the first time since she had known her, Holly looked worried, and that, more than anything, made Amelia afraid. She didn't know it yet, but something was coming, and Holly knew it too. At first, it was easy to dismiss Holly's behavior as nothing more than a slight change in routine. Maybe she was adjusting to her new life, learning to relax in a world without strict commands and combat drills. But as the days passed, Amelia began to notice something strange. Holly wasn't just acting restless, she was acting like a guardian on high alert. It started on their walks home from school. Amelia and Holly had a set path they always took, weaving through a quiet residential street before cutting through a small alleyway lined with fences and backyard gardens. It was a shortcut, one Amelia had used for years without a second thought. But now, Holly refused to walk through it without hesitation. The first time it happened, Amelia had tugged at the leash, urging her forward. But Holly planted her paws firmly, her body tense, ears flicking forward as if listening to something just out of reach. And then came the growl, a deep, low sound that made the hairs on Amelia's arms stand on end. She followed Holly's gaze down the alley, scanning the wooden fences and trash bins. But there was nothing there, just an empty path leading home. "What's wrong, girl?" Amelia whispered, tightening her grip on the leash. Holly didn't answer, of course, but her body spoke for her. Her tail was stiff, her muscles taut, and the growl in her throat never faded completely. Eventually, Amelia gave in and took the longer way home, avoiding the alley altogether. It wasn't a one-time thing. Each day after that, Holly's reactions grew more intense. The growls came sooner, her stance more defensive, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. It wasn't just the alley anymore, it was everything. If a car slowed down near them, she would step in front of Amelia, ears pricked forward, unmoving until it was gone. If a stranger walked too close, she would lean into Amelia, pushing her subtly away while keeping herself between the girl and the unknown figure. Amelia tried to ignore the creeping unease that came with Holly's behavior, but it wasn't easy. She trusted Holly, but a part of her still wanted to believe that her dog was just being overly protective. After all, nothing bad had ever happened in Silverwood. That changed one chilly afternoon. School had let out later than usual, and the sun was already beginning to dip behind the rooftops as Amelia walked toward the front gate, her backpack slung over one shoulder. As always, Holly was there, waiting, tail wagging slightly, but posture rigid. "Hey, girl," Amelia greeted, bending down to scratch behind her ears. But Holly barely reacted. Her focus was locked onto something across the street. Amelia turned her head, following Holly's gaze. A black pickup truck sat idling a few yards away, its engine humming softly. The windows were tinted, and at first Amelia thought nothing of it. Just another car waiting for a student to hop in. But then she noticed the driver. A man wearing dark sunglasses despite the dimming light sat motionless behind the wheel. He wasn't looking at the school. He wasn't checking his phone. He was looking at her. Amelia's stomach twisted. Holly let out a quiet but unmistakable growl. "Come on," Amelia muttered, gripping Holly's leash a little tighter. She turned on her heel, forcing herself to act normal, her heart suddenly pounding faster than it should have been. Holly stayed close, pressing against her leg as they walked. Amelia could feel it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. It crawled up her spine like an itch she couldn't scratch, making her glance over her shoulder, despite knowing she wouldn't like what she saw. The truck hadn't moved, but the man was still staring. Then, just as quickly as the moment had begun, he shifted gears and pulled away, disappearing down the street without a word. Amelia let out a shaky breath, but Holly didn't relax. That night at dinner, she told her dad about it. "It was probably just some guy waiting for someone," Ethan said, though his brow furrowed slightly. "But he didn't pick anyone up," Amelia insisted. "He was just watching." Ethan chewed on that for a moment. Then he turned to Holly, who sat by Amelia's chair, ears still slightly perked. "And she didn't like him?" Amelia shook her head. Ethan let out a slow exhale and nodded. "All right. I'll keep an eye out. But if you see that truck again, you let me know, okay?" Amelia nodded, but it didn't make her feel any better. And neither did what happened next. 2 nights later, long after the house had settled into sleep, a deep, guttural bark shattered the silence. Ethan was on his feet in an instant. Holly was at the front window, her entire body rigid, ears pressed forward, her lips slightly curled in a silent snarl. Ethan stepped closer, following her line of sight. Outside, the street was empty. The trees rustled slightly in the wind. The neighbor's porch light flickered dimly. But Ethan knew better than to assume Holly was barking at nothing. He opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin, and for a moment, all he heard was the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. Then, a shuffle. A barely there sound, like gravel shifting under careful footsteps. Ethan's muscles tensed. "Holly, stay," he commanded. The dog hesitated, then obeyed, though her body remained coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. Ethan took another step forward, scanning the yard, the street, the shadows between the houses. Nothing, but the feeling was there, that same gnawing sensation Amelia had described, the feeling of being watched. After a long moment, he turned back inside, locking the door behind him. Holly didn't settle for the rest of the night. She stayed by the window, unmoving, staring into the darkness as if daring whatever was out there to come closer. And Ethan? For the first time since he had returned to Silverwood, he felt something he hadn't in years. A quiet, creeping sense of danger. Something was out there. Holly knew it. And soon, he feared, they all would. The first complaints started as whispers. A murmur here, a hushed conversation there. At first, Amelia didn't notice, and neither did Ethan, but Holly did. It began with subtle things, uneasy glances from neighbors, parents clutching their children's hands a little tighter as they passed by, a shift in the air when Holly walked through town. The people of Silverwood, once friendly and warm, had started to look at the White family's beloved dog with something different in their eyes. Not admiration, not respect, fear. The tipping point came on a crisp autumn morning. Amelia and Holly had just reached the school gates when she noticed a few parents gathered near the entrance, their heads bent together in quiet discussion. It wasn't unusual for parents to chat while dropping off their kids, but something about the way they kept glancing toward her and Holly made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Then, as if sensing the weight of their stares, Holly let out a low, quiet growl. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. A woman, a mother of one of Amelia's classmates, gasped and stepped back, gripping her son's shoulder protectively. "That dog is dangerous," she muttered, loud enough for Amelia to hear. "No, she's not," Amelia blurted, tightening her grip on Holly's leash. The woman's eyes flicked toward her, mouth pressing into a thin line. "Honey, I know you love your dog, but it's not safe to have a big animal like that around children." "She's not just a dog," Amelia protested, her voice rising with emotion. "She's protecting me." A man standing beside her scoffed. "From what?" "This is Silverwood. Nothing happens here." Amelia's heart pounded in frustration. They didn't understand. They didn't see the way Holly watched, how she knew things before anyone else did, how she had sensed the danger lurking just beyond their vision. Before she could argue, a teacher stepped forward. "Amelia, I think it's best if you take Holly home for today," she said gently. "We don't want anyone feeling uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The words stung. Amelia swallowed hard, looking down at Holly, who stood unwavering by her side. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she was just standing there. But it didn't matter. The judgment had already been passed. That afternoon, when Amelia returned home, she stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with frustration. "They don't get it," she fumed, throwing her backpack onto the chair. "They think Holly's dangerous just because she growled once." Ethan, who was pouring himself a cup of coffee, frowned. "Who thinks that?" "Everyone," Amelia spat. "The parents, the teachers. They made me take her home early." Ethan set down his mug. "That's ridiculous. Holly's never been aggressive without reason." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Ethan, maybe they have a point." Silence filled the room. Amelia felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "What?" she whispered. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm just saying. She has been acting differently lately, more protective, more reactive. Maybe it's making people nervous." "She's acting like that because she knows something is wrong," Amelia shot back. Ethan folded his arms. "Sarah, you know as well as I do that Holly isn't a threat. She's been trained better than any dog in this town." Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "I know that. But the school doesn't. The other parents don't." She sighed again, softer this time. "I just don't want Amelia to be isolated because of this." Amelia looked between them, her hands clenched at her sides. "You don't believe me either," she murmured. "Amelia, sweetheart, it's not that," Sarah began, but Amelia was already shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "You think I'm imagining things. You think Holly's the problem." "Amelia—" But she didn't wait for her mother to finish. Instead, she turned on her heel and rushed up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her. Holly followed, her nails clicking against the hardwood floor as she padded inside. Amelia collapsed onto her bed, pressing her face into her hands. A knot of frustration and sadness swelled in her chest. She felt alone. No one understood. No one believed her. Except Holly. The dog climbed onto the bed beside her, resting her head on Amelia's lap. The warmth of her fur was comforting, steady. Amelia reached down, running her fingers through Holly's coat. "They don't understand," she whispered, voice trembling. Holly let out a soft whine, nuzzling closer. "But I do," Amelia continued, blinking back tears. "I know you're trying to keep me safe." She wrapped her arms around Holly, hugging her tight. Outside, the world was shifting. The town had turned its back on them, but Holly never would. The walk home felt unfamiliar without Holly by her side. For the first time in years, Amelia walked alone, her fingers curling tightly around the strap of her backpack as the cool autumn air whispered through the empty streets of Silverwood. She had never minded walking home before. Silverwood was safe, predictable, a place where nothing bad ever happened. At least, that's what people like to believe. But today, an unsettling feeling clung to her skin, a quiet sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Without Holly's steady presence beside her, the world felt different, bigger, darker, and much less safe. She missed the soft jingle of Holly's collar, the comforting rhythm of her paws against the pavement, the way the dog would glance up at her every few steps, making sure Amelia was still beside her, still protected. But Holly wasn't here. Not today. Because of the school's new rule. Because people didn't understand. Because they thought Holly was a problem. A bitter knot twisted in Amelia's stomach as she walked faster, her sneakers tapping against the pavement in quick, uneven beats. She was halfway home now, just a few more blocks. If she hurried, she'd be back in the safety of her house in no time. Then, she heard it. A low hum. At first, it was barely noticeable, blending into the distant sounds of birds chirping and the rustling leaves. But as she reached the next intersection, it grew louder. A deep, steady rumble coming from somewhere behind her. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder. A black pickup truck was rolling slowly down the street. Her pulse spiked. She kept walking. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then the truck stopped. A few yards ahead, it pulled to the curb and idled, its engine still vibrating softly in the cool afternoon air. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wrapped in a dark jacket, the brim of a baseball cap shadowing his face. He stood by the truck for a moment, unmoving. Then, he took a slow step toward her. "Hey there," he called out, his voice calm. Too calm. Amelia's grip tightened around the straps of her backpack. "You lost?" the man asked. Her stomach twisted. "No," she said quickly, forcing her feet to move, forcing herself not to freeze. The man took another step closer. "You sure?" "I think I saw you back there, looking like you needed a ride." Her legs locked in place. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Then, from the corner of her vision, a shadow moved. And then, a deafening crash. The wooden fence to her right exploded as Holly tore through it, shards of wood flying in every direction, a blur of fur, a snarl that sent chills down Amelia's spine. And then Holly launched herself at the man. The man barely had time to react before Holly's teeth clamped onto his forearm, powerful jaws sinking deep into flesh. He let out a sharp, startled cry, stumbling backward as Holly snarled and twisted, refusing to let go. "Get off me, you stupid!" He shook his arm violently, but Holly wouldn't budge. She was pure muscle, pure determination, pure protection. Amelia stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps as she watched her best friend transform into a force of nature. But then, a second man stepped out from the passenger side of the truck. Amelia's stomach dropped. The man was taller than the first, broader, his eyes colder, calculating. Holly saw him immediately. She released the first man and whirled around with a savage snarl, planting herself firmly between Amelia and the second attacker. The man didn't hesitate. He lunged. Holly met him mid-air. They collided in a vicious tangle of fur and limbs, Holly snapping and twisting, teeth flashing under the dimming sky. The man grunted in pain, stumbling as Holly raked her claws against his jacket, teeth searching for purchase. But this one was stronger, and he wasn't alone. The first man had recovered, his face twisted in rage and pain. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a heavy metal pipe. Amelia's heart stopped. "Holly!" The sickening thud echoed through the street as the pipe swung hard, slamming into Holly's side. The impact sent her crashing to the ground, a sharp yelp escaping her throat. Amelia's world froze. Holly lay there, stunned. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, legs trembling as she tried to push herself back up. She snarled again, lower this time, her body swaying. But she didn't run. She didn't back down. Amelia's pulse pounded in her ears. "No," she whispered. The first man raised the pipe again. Then, a voice roared through the street. "Hey!" The world snapped back into motion as Ethan appeared, running full speed down the road. Behind him, several neighbors burst from their houses, drawn by the noise. Porch lights flickered on. The two men hesitated. The second man cursed under his breath. Then, they bolted for the truck. The engine roared to life as they sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. Ethan skidded to a stop beside Amelia, his chest heaving as he took in the scene. His eyes landed on Holly, panting heavily, her body trembling. "Oh, God," he breathed. Amelia collapsed to her knees beside Holly, her fingers tangling in the thick fur, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me," she whispered, voice breaking. Holly let out a weak, painful whine, pressing her head against Amelia's lap, and that was when Ethan saw it. The blood, not from the men, from Holly. She had been hurt, badly. Ethan's jaw clenched. He scooped Holly into his arms, ignoring the sticky warmth that spread across his shirt. "We're getting her to the vet," he said, his voice shaking. Amelia wiped at her tears, nodding quickly. She reached out, her small fingers brushing over Holly's fur. "Please stay," she whispered. Holly's tail thumped weakly against the ground. It was the last thing she did before her eyes fluttered shut. The drive to the veterinary hospital felt like it stretched on forever. Ethan's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The truck's tires screeched as he took the corner too fast. But he didn't care. He couldn't care. Not when Holly was lying motionless in the back seat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Amelia sat beside her, one hand tangled in Holly's blood-matted fur, the other covering her mouth as if trying to hold back a flood of sobs. "Hold on, girl," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice breaking. "Just hold on." Holly didn't respond. Amelia shifted, pressing herself closer to the dog's side. Her hands trembled as she stroked Holly's ears, trying to keep her awake. "You have to stay with me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, Holly, you have to." The warmth of Holly's body was still there, but it was fading. Too fast. The lights of Silverwood Veterinary Clinic finally came into view, a beacon of desperate hope in the darkness. Ethan barely put the truck in park before throwing the door open and rushing to the back seat. The moment he lifted Holly into his arms, her head lolled against his chest, her breathing weak. "Help!" Ethan called as he sprinted toward the clinic doors. "Somebody, please!" The glass doors swung open. A vet technician and a tall woman in a white coat rushed forward, eyes widening at the sight of Holly's limp form. "Bring her in, now!" the vet commanded, ushering them inside. Ethan laid Holly onto the examination table, stepping back only when the vet and her team moved in around the injured dog. Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "She's hurt bad," Ethan told the vet, voice strained. "Took a hit to the side with a pipe. There was blood, a lot of it." The vet, Dr. Evans, nodded sharply, already checking Holly's pulse, pressing her fingers gently along the dog's ribs. When she reached the injured area, Holly let out a weak whimper, her eyes barely flickering open. Amelia let out a broken sob. Dr. Evans turned to one of the technicians. "Get me fluids and prep for surgery, now." A pit opened in Ethan's stomach. "Surgery?" Amelia whispered. Dr. Evans turned, her expression unreadable. "She's lost a lot of blood. Her vitals are weak. If there are internal injuries, she won't make it through the night without immediate intervention." Amelia shook her head furiously. "No, she'll make it. She has to." The vet's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I'll do everything I can, but you need to prepare yourself. Even if she survives the surgery, she might not wake up." Silence. Amelia's world tilted. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Not wake up? Number. That wasn't an option. She rushed to the table, wrapping her arms around Holly's neck. "You have to fight," she whispered into the dog's fur. "You're a fighter, Holly. You're my hero. Please don't leave me." Holly's tail gave the faintest, weakest thump against the table. Then she stopped moving altogether. "Amelia," Ethan said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They need to take her now." Amelia let out a choked sob, but nodded. Dr. Evans and her team moved quickly, wheeling Holly toward the back. The last thing Amelia saw before the doors swung shut was the limp way Holly's paw hung over the edge of the table. Then she was gone, and the waiting began. The minutes crawled by like hours. Ethan paced the length of the waiting room, his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. Amelia sat curled in one of the plastic chairs, Holly's collar clutched tightly in her hands. Sarah had arrived 10 minutes after they did, still in her hospital scrubs, her face pale with worry. She sat beside Amelia, running a hand over the little girl's trembling back. No one spoke. Every few minutes, Amelia's eyes flicked toward the clock on the wall, then to the closed surgery doors. 1 hour passed, then 2. Still, nothing. Amelia squeezed Holly's collar so hard it bit into her palms. Ethan sat beside her, finally still for the first time that night. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "I should have seen this coming," he muttered. Sarah looked at him, confused. "Ethan?" "No." He shook his head. "I knew Holly was sensing something. I saw it in her. She was trying to protect Amelia, and He swallowed hard. "I let them take her away. I let them turn her into the bad guy." His jaw tightened as he stared at the ground. "She was right all along, and we didn't listen." Sarah reached for his hand. "Ethan, this isn't your fault." But Ethan barely seemed to hear her. He looked toward the surgery doors, his hands clenching into fists. "She's a fighter," he whispered. "She won't give up." The words were meant for himself as much as they were for Amelia. But Amelia just buried her face in her hands and prayed. 3 hours later, Dr. Evans emerged from surgery. Amelia shot up from her chair so fast she nearly tripped. Ethan steadied her, his own heart hammering. The vet took off her gloves, sighing. "She's stable." Relief hit Amelia so hard her knees almost buckled. "But," Dr. Evans continued. Ethan tensed. "But," the vet's expression remained serious. "It was close. She lost a lot of blood. We repaired the internal bleeding, but she's weak. The next 24 hours are critical. If she wakes up, she has a chance. But we won't know until morning." Silence stretched between them. Then Amelia stepped forward. "Can I see her?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Evans nodded. "Just for a moment." The sight of Holly nearly broke Amelia's heart. She lay on a soft recovery bed, bandaged and bruised, her breathing slow and shallow. An IV dripped fluids into her foreleg. Machines beeped softly, monitoring her fragile condition. Amelia knelt beside her, taking Holly's paw into her hands. "You did it," she whispered, tears slipping down her face. "You saved me." Holly didn't stir, didn't even twitch. Amelia swallowed hard, resting her forehead against Holly's. "You have to wake up," she pleaded. "I need you." Ethan stood behind her, his own throat tight. He placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder. "She's a warrior," he said softly. "She won't give up." Amelia nodded, but deep down, she was terrified Holly already had. Justice and redemption. Holly becomes a hero. The waiting was the hardest part. Amelia hadn't left Holly's side since the surgery. She had spent the entire night curled up in a chair beside the recovery bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines that monitored Holly's fragile heartbeat. Every beep, every shallow breath, every tiny rise and fall of Holly's chest kept her anchored between hope and fear. She had barely slept. Every time her eyelids drooped, she'd jolt awake, afraid that if she drifted off, Holly might slip away. Morning sunlight streamed through the clinic's window, casting soft golden light across the sterile room. Amelia barely noticed. All she could focus on was Holly, her best friend, her protector, the one who had nearly given everything to save her. Then it happened. A small twitch, a flicker of movement in Holly's tail. Amelia gasped, sitting up so quickly that she nearly knocked over the IV stand. "Holly?" The dog let out the faintest of whines, her body still heavy with exhaustion. But her tail, it moved. Tears blurred Amelia's vision as she leaned forward, gently cupping Holly's face in her hands. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice breaking. Holly's amber eyes flickered open, still groggy. But when she saw Amelia, her tail gave another weak thump against the blanket. That was all it took. A sob tore through Amelia's chest as she buried her face into Holly's fur, relief crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You came back," she whispered. "I knew you would." Ethan and Sarah, who had been standing just outside the room, rushed inside the moment they heard Amelia's cries. Ethan's face, usually so strong and composed, softened with pure relief when he saw Holly blinking up at them. "She's gonna be okay," Ethan murmured, running a hand over Holly's head. Amelia nodded furiously, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "She's a fighter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew she wouldn't leave me." Meanwhile, justice was being served. The police had been busy through the night, piecing together the case against the men who had tried to take Amelia. Turns out, they had been watching her for weeks. The black pickup truck? It had been spotted in the area multiple times before the attack. The men, they weren't just random criminals. They were part of a larger operation targeting small towns, preying on the false sense of security places like Silverwood provided. But what they hadn't counted on was Holly. Because of Holly, their plan had failed. Because of Holly, Amelia was safe. And now, they were behind bars, facing charges that would ensure they never saw the outside world again. When Sheriff Lawson arrived at the clinic later that morning, he shook Ethan's hand firmly. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, he said, "and I've seen a lot, but I've never seen anything like what your dog did last night." Ethan glanced at Holly, still lying weakly on the bed but alert, watching them with her sharp, intelligent eyes. "She's not just a dog," Ethan said. "She's family." The sheriff nodded. "That's exactly what she is." The news of Holly's heroism spread like wildfire. By the next day, the entire town of Silverwood knew what had happened. The same people who had once whispered behind Amelia's back, who had judged Holly without knowing the truth, were now singing a different tune. Strangers stopped Amelia and her parents in town, asking about Holly, wanting to know if she was okay. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the dangerous dog now spoke of her with admiration and respect. She saved that little girl's life. She knew something was wrong before any of us did. We should have listened. Guilt rippled through the community. They had turned their backs on Holly. They had let fear dictate their judgment, but Holly had protected them anyway. A week later, the town did something they had never done before. They honored a dog. The mayor himself organized the event. It was held in the town square right outside Amelia's school. A stage had been set up, decorated with banners, and in the center of it all was a small plaque engraved with Holly's name. Amelia stood beside Holly, still bandaged but recovering, as the mayor stepped forward to speak. "Silverwood is a town built on trust, on looking out for one another," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. And recently we failed in that duty. We let fear blind us to the truth. A hush fell over the crowd. But one among us didn't, the mayor continued, turning to Holly. She knew what we didn't. She saw the danger we ignored. And when the time came, she didn't hesitate. She did what no one else could. She saved Amelia White. A swell of applause filled the square. Amelia beamed, reaching down to scratch behind Holly's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, her tail wagging gently. The mayor smiled, then turned to the audience. So today we make it right. Today we honor our town's bravest guardian. He gestured toward the plaque. It read, Holly, Silverwood's hero. For the first time since everything had happened, Amelia felt whole again. As the ceremony wrapped up, Amelia knelt beside Holly, wrapping her arms gently around the dog's neck. Holly rested her head against Amelia's shoulder, her warm breath tickling the girl's skin. "You did it," Amelia whispered. "You saved me." Holly's tail thumped against the ground. Amelia smiled, pressing her forehead to Holly's. "You're my protector," she murmured, voice soft but full of love. "And I promise I'll always protect you too." And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything was right in the world again. At its core, this is more than just one of those dog stories about loyalty and courage. It is a profound reflection on trust, intuition, and the bonds that defy logic, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful protectors come in the form of those who cannot speak but understand more than we ever could. There is something undeniably special about the connection between a human and their dog. It is built not on words, but on an unspoken language of love, trust, and unwavering devotion. In this heartwarming story, we see that bond tested and ultimately proven in the most extraordinary way. Holly was not just a pet. She was a guardian, an instinctive protector who sensed danger long before anyone else did. Her story teaches us that true loyalty is not conditional. It does not waver in the face of doubt or fear. Even when the world turned against her, Holly never abandoned her duty. Perhaps what makes this story so deeply moving is how it reflects a reality we often overlook. How many times have we ignored signs that something is wrong, dismissing them as overreactions? How often do we let fear dictate our judgment, turning against those who only seek to protect us? The townspeople in this story are not villains. They are simply human. They acted on fear, not understanding. But like all great lessons, growth came through hardship. They realized their mistake, not when it was easy, but when it mattered most. This story also speaks to a universal truth. Heroes do not always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they walk on four legs with wagging tails and hearts too big for their bodies. Holly's instinct, her bravery, and her love for Amelia were not things she had to think about. They were simply who she was. And in the end, she not only saved a life, she changed an entire town's way of thinking. Beyond the suspense and emotion, this tale holds a message of redemption. It reminds us that while we may make mistakes, we are always capable of making things right. The people of Silverwood may have doubted Holly once, but they ultimately found a way to honor her, to recognize the truth they had been blind to before. That act of recognition is just as important as the heroism itself. It is an acknowledgement of the lessons we must carry forward. Stories like these stay with us not just because they are dramatic or thrilling, but because they resonate on a deeply emotional level. They remind us of the beauty in selfless love, of the importance of listening to our instincts, and of the courage it takes to stand by those who protect us, even when the world tells us not to. And perhaps, most importantly, it reaffirms something that every dog lover already knows. Dogs are not just animals. They are family. They are protectors. They are, in the purest sense, love embodied. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.